This is beautiful. Oh, fantastic. And so here's mine again. Karen, did you get the hardback? Oops, here we go.
No, not yet. I've been looking for it every day.
You know what? It's DeJoy. DeJoy is to blame for this. I'm sure of it.
Well,
So
if it's in the post, if it's in the postal system, who knows?
well, hopefully it gets to you soon. Okay.
Yeah.
So today we're going to be talking about book 4, and as usual, I'm going to do a really quick run through. Everyone, welcome me and Karen, who I'm delighted to see again this week. Couldn't join us last week. And again, the beautiful Julia Holloway is here once again, and I can't wait for today's discussion because the subject is heavy, it's intense, right? It's trauma and memory and forgetting, and it's presented in a way that hopefully eases some of the impact of the trauma, because I know that oftentimes when there are depictions of violence in literature or in film, it's very sudden and it's very acute. And this entire book sort of spreads out it sort of doles out the doses of trauma, and someone described it to me as sort of a jigsaw puzzle coming together, rather than just simply describing sequentially, this happened, then this happened, then this happened, because it starts out with a very unclear sense of exactly what happened. I believe Karen and you and I, when we first talked about it, you were really deeply impacted by the cat. I remember you said, "Oh, that cat," or maybe it was somebody else. Maybe it was somebody else who was really upset about the cat. And my reaction was to just wait, because I thought the way the story comes out, it really does. It takes a while for the mind to catch up, right? Because the story is not. It's not unveiling itself clearly until the very end, and then it's interwoven with this folk tale that keeps recurring in Maya's mind, the story of the hawk and the chicken. And it seems like a soap opera that's happening off on the side. And so I'm just going to do a very quick overview, and then let's talk about it. This time I'm hoping to say as little as possible, because I really am curious about how readers receive this. I really am curious about how you, Julia, receive this kind of episode. So book 4, as I said, the title here is Rosie Ran Away. And the epigraph, the description, is basically about how Esther's compassion inspired Mamma Akoth to sing a song of becoming for Rosie, the cat, and how Maya adopted him reluctantly. And that encapsulates essentially their relationship, right? How Ma Ruth and MaAnna rained down their wrath on Maya after Rosie disappeared. How Alex finds his baby sister and allows her to forget by holding the memory of her brutalized body. How Maya escapes into recurring reveries of the tale of Gweno and Chicken Ongowo and the hawk and the magic needle that set the course of their lives. So rather than overview the entire episode, let me just read the first paragraph of Canto 22. It's one of my favorite passages. I thoroughly enjoyed writing it. A lot of it was memory recollection. A lot of it was, bits and pieces of experiential memory of the beauty of this place where these children grew up, right? And obviously it's a patchwork from my memory, but I think the whole thing creates a whole. So Canto 22 begins. On the grounds of the house into which Maya was born, in the Ngong Hills in Nairobi, there stood a tall jacaranda tree that reigned over the garden in the back. It spread its old branches far to shield the flower bed on one side and the veranda on the other, settling its longest twigs comfortably on the edge of the red terracotta tiled roof of the house. A ring of sundry chalk-washed stones decorated the border of the flower bed, where giant spotted sisal plants grew, and hibiscus trumpets and clusters of bougainvillea adorned the light of the air with splashes of red and pink and orange accents, sending their papery petals to litter the grass as the season gradually matured. When the jacaranda tree bloomed, its small tuber-shaped flowers came out in dense lilac clumps, and from afar transformed the weathered tree into a cloudy dome of layered pastel halos that danced in the breeze. The falling flowers of the old tree, together with the bougainvillea and the hibiscus, covered the ground with a soft carpet of wilting petals, in some places so thick, excuse me, in some places so thick that even the bright yellow and black weaverbirds, who rarely ventured below the middle branches of the jacaranda tree, sometimes felt safe burrowing into the floral carpet to harvest from the bounty of worms and larvae in the ground, secure that they were hidden from sight. This was Rosie's domain. And this is how the next paragraph begins. Okay. So I wanted to read this passage especially because I think very rarely in Rain is there a description of place, like, or very rarely does an hello, Elizabeth.
Thanks.
How are you? We've gotten started. We're gonna go ahead. Let's set up.
Okay.
Can you turn on your video so we can see you?
Bye.
Can you turn on your video so we can see you, my dear? I think so. Anyway, as I was saying, so I wanted to start this today's talk with this passage because rarely in Rain does a book or a canto begin with the description of place, right? With a sort of like what do they call it? A topographical description, right? And hey, Elizabeth, good to see you. Let me unmute that. Oh, sorry, hang on. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Oh, fine, thank you. No, it's wonderful to see you. So I'm going to stop for just a second to welcome you. I'm so happy to see you. You're one of the old girls, right?
Yes. Elizabeth.
Welcome. So
Yeah.
you've probably seen Karen and Julia here before in our previous talks. Julia has been with me from the very beginning. This is going to be a sort of our joint adventure together. And
Mm-hmm.
Karen has come to, I think you maybe missed just one, Karen, maybe because last week you had to work. But Karen was one of the first people to get a copy of Rain as soon as it came out of the press, like fresh out of the oven.
Yeah.
Karen had a copy. And I'm so very happy that you're joining us today.
Unfortunately, I've been so involved in other things, so I haven't actually caught up reading.
Uh-huh.
So I just wanted to show that I'm starting to read, and I just wanted to honor you today. So
thank you so much. I really
listen to you guys.
No, I absolutely appreciate that. As long as you don't mind spoilers of things to come.
It's okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And if you have any questions, I think the three of us are pretty much, I think we're available to answer or respond to any questions about the book, about the reading that you may have. Okay, my dear?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so as I was saying, I really enjoyed writing this passage because aside from the description of the savannah, a lot of which happens through the eyes of Mamma Akoth or through the eyes of Maya, there are no, or even the descriptions of man-made places, like the description of the cathedrals and monuments through the eyes of different characters. This is the only place, I think, that is being described from the perspective of a member of the family who is not a human being, in this case, Rosie, right? Rosie, who exists outside of the plane of human experience and therefore has a very, I think almost an omniscient perspective of things that is completely devoid of judgment, and yet is able to see the world in details that we as human beings wouldn't see, right? We wouldn't pay attention to what's under the canopy of petals that fall on the grass. We wouldn't necessarily pay attention to what's between, sisal plants in a garden. We wouldn't pay attention to the fact that the branches of the jacaranda tree rest on the terracotta roof, because it really doesn't matter to us. But all of this really does matter to Rosie. So in essence, this book, Rosie Ran Away, first brings us into the world of Rosie. And gradually, as the book continues, canto by canto, we get to see how Rosie is essentially cast out of this paradise, but by circumstances that are not of his own doing, right? And it's circumstances born of a mixture of misunderstanding and even the cat's own trauma. I was really interested reading this last night and thinking, what about Rosie's trauma? And I think, Karen, you and I talked about this a little bit when I was talking about how weeks ago I was thinking that what's curious about Rosie is Maya, who, as we know her as a child, is quite cheeky and a little bit obstinate, right? She makes fun of her brother's stutter. She's kind of intransigent even with Alex, and she's sort of spoiled, right? Because Alex completely adores her and forgives her everything, and she, because we know that she's having an experience of the world that's different from everyone else and also a lot richer than Alex's, and yet she's not quite mature enough as a child to understand it critically. She still has a very deep-rooted sense of skepticism when she hears anything from him or from anyone else that her experience, like her dreamwalker experience, counters. Anyway, we know that Maya is not an angel. Maya is not a perfect person. And sometimes she's not terribly nice either, right? But we also know that in that unniceness, some of it comes out as a lack of empathy, as contrasted, for example, with Esther. Esther, who is so completely empathic, right? Or empathetic, even to the most volatile and troubled of her siblings, David. Esther, who is the one who's able to see the most beautiful part of their mother, like the most tender moment that her mother experiences, and she sees it almost as if it were a secret. So if Esther is the embodiment of empathy and memory, Maya is on the antipode of that. She's not empathetic, and she is given to forgetting, especially forgetting painful things. And yet, when it comes to Rosie, Maya drops everything for Rosie's sake, right? When Rosie's in pain, when Rosie is panicking, Maya doesn't even think about herself. And even after she realizes that she's injured, it doesn't register. Now, someone can be, a friend of mine called me, he loves physics. He called me and he was like, I'm reading this girl's trauma, and all I can think of is that she's in shock and she's like flooded with adrenaline, right? Because that's the only thing that can account for a description of an arm that's torn that way, and yet she keeps trying to protect the cat, right? And so this book for me was very interesting to watch the awakening in Maya of things that maybe before this incident hadn't been awakened. One of them, the very conscientious empathy for another, for the well-being of another, right? And then the second thing, watching her actually forget trauma in order to deal with it. And then I believe the third thing that I found interesting about Maya was then using the oral tradition that she grew up in to create a safe space for her mind, for her soul, a place to escape, right? So with that, I'm going to sit back and open the conversation to any ideas, observations, reactions that you may have about this book, please.
How old is Maya here?
At this point, Maya is about 5 years old.
Okay, I thought.
Yeah, yeah, she's in that range. This is something that happens before that time we saw them in the library looking at maps, because by the time this happens,
She's still got
remember,
the gauze on her arm at that point.
she still has the what?
Do you remember in the library? She's got the gauze on her arm.
Yes. So this all of this happened before before that visit to the
Just
library.
before.
Exactly, just before it. So that's when, and then remember how when they're in the library, all she kept asking is Rosie coming back with no details
Right.
about what happened, and the only
Yeah.
person who was troubled by it was Alex. Like he was happy he was happy when the theological debate started, because it meant that they didn't have to talk about that particular incident anymore, right? So at that point in the library, we were told that Alex is twice her age. He's 10 years old, she's 5. And so this is happening when Maya is about 5 years old. Let me just add one more detail. Um, Although the next book will actually accompany her on that big dream walk that she has on the ship, right? And this is happening when she's 5 years old. Remember, she's already had some before, maybe without being aware of it. But she had one when Hera was being named. And Mamma Akoth is the one who could see that, right? When she was reciting the Portuguese scripture, which gave Mamma Akoth the the courage to break with tradition and claim Hera, right? And so that happened when Maya was 2 years old. So this particular trauma, it's I think it's catalytic in a lot of ways. It catalyzes a sort of a latent empathy by directing it at Rosie's trauma. It catalyzes um, this sort of active ability to forget trauma by transposing attention to a folk tale, right? To this fantastical
Right.
world that is not real. Um,
Yes.
and yeah, so let me then stop there, please.
It creates an alternate universe.
Mm-hmm,
I would like just first to mention,
mm-hmm,
I loved Elizabeth saying she was an old girl, because
mm-hmm,
really all of us who've gone to boarding school in the sort
mm-hmm,
of English tradition, we have
mm-hmm,
this camaraderie for the rest of our lives. And it gives us a kind of shared culture, which at the same moment is also a trauma because we're separated from our families, from our parents,
mm-hmm,
in order to become sponges to absorb this other culture.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And my schoolmates, most of them were, I mean, I was growing up in England. Most of the school children I was aboard of with, their parents were abroad in the Bahamas, in Africa, in India, and so forth. So really, we share a culture together,
mm-hmm,
even if it's a culture that at the same time is imposed on us. And we
mm-hmm,
have to learn how to negotiate that and make it, as you have done in this book, to create the two worlds together. To go back to, I loved this part, it's terrifying at the same time. When the cat sees its image in the mirror,
mm-hmm,
that is also Maya seeing herself in the
mm-hmm,
cat.
mm-hmm.
She is the feral cat.
Wow, wow, yeah.
Isn't that the case? I mean, it's sort of an Alice in Wonderland and Alice through the Looking Glass moment
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
when Maya and the cat together go through this trauma.
mm-hmm,
It's a shared trauma,
mm-hmm,
and it damages Maya. It
mm-hmm,
also, uh, I was in a very difficult marriage with my husband was very disturbed mentally,
mm-hmm.
and he tended to kill first my cat and
Oh,
then my son's cat and then my children's cat.
oh
And
my
when he
God.
killed my son's cat, this was when he was
Oh my
2 years
God.
old, and I was reading Freud, and Freud in Melancholia, his essay, and he describes how in the grieving process,
Mhm.
the person becomes the one he has lost.
Mhm.
And Richard, my son, whom I've just lost to lung cancer in
Mhm.
Philadelphia, at that point, he became the cat that was lost.
Mhm.
And he had to lap milk from a bowl on the floor like a cat.
Mhm.
And I think what you have done with Maya and Rosie is extremely powerful. And you're talking about this identity
Mhm.
that she has, which is shattered as the way you narrate the story. It's like the broken pieces of a mirror
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
don't match up
Mhm.
any longer. They keep showing fragments of the vision,
Mhm.
fragments with the oral tale. But I love the way you have this little child in
Mhm.
this, which Americans wouldn't have. We would
Mhm.
not have 6 foot long bathtubs, but you
Mhm.
did. And so there is this little child floating in this massive amount of water.
Mhm.
And it's the most wonderful description of how she is able to assuage that trauma.
Mhm.
It's magnificent writing that you've done.
That's interesting that Adoyo, that when she said that the one scene depicted where you saw the cat in the mirror. I haven't read this part yet, but I'm just like that surprised you. Yet you're the one who wrote the book. So so is it that when you're a writer, sometimes it's flowing out, but when other people read it, they can see more into it than what you even thought?
Wow, that is it's really interesting. I think every time we've met, this has come up, hasn't it? Like this idea. And I always wonder about it. The stance that I've taken, the way I'm coming to peace with it, and part of the reason why I love these roundtable talks, and the reason being that I want to invite other people's reception. I want to hear how other people are reading Rain, what they're experiencing as they read it. But the stance that I've taken that reconciles me with what exactly what you just described, my surprise and often really wonderful surprise and sometimes confused surprise, right? When I hear about the reception, is because my attitude toward Rain is that I'm the scribe of a story that I'm listening to. And even while I was writing it, I do remember, I think I mentioned this in the afterword of the book, thinking that when I first started writing out, I was thinking about the stories my great grandmother used to tell and how she used to tell those stories, right? My my initial impetus was, oh, I want to share with people what it feels like to hear my great grandmother tell a story, right? Because it's something that took us somewhere else completely. It was transporting, it was transformative. And every time we went to visit her, or she knew that we knew that she was visiting, the thing that we most looked forward to was her storytelling. And I remember thinking, this is something that I know I'm privy to because of where I grew up, with the family that I grew up with, and the culture and heritage that I grew up with, because I haven't seen it anywhere else in the world, or at least I haven't seen it, shared publicly anywhere else in the world. So, in my capacity I did start out as a literary scholar. I was like, okay, let me add to the body of stories that the world has access to this particular form, so that, and I kid you not, I've told this to all my friends, one day somebody walking by a library will randomly pick this book off the shelf, open it, and go, oh, this is the book I've been looking for. Like, this is the story I've been looking for. And so I started by thinking that, ascribe to what I was hearing. And it took on a life of its own, because at first, again, you write what you know, and you write within the context you know. And within the context I know, a document like this, a work like this, right, is
Mhm.
called a novel. So I
Mhm.
thought I was writing a novel. And yet the way the story was emerging was defying all the conventions that I knew about novels, right? It refused to behave like a novel. And there was a moment of wrestling there. I started writing this in 2003, if you can believe it. Um,
Mhm.
so there was a moment of wrestling, there was a long hiatus. And eventually, when I came back to it, I thought to myself, you know what? Why am I fighting with this text? Why don't I just do what it wants me to do? And let it do its thing, and then I will put at its service, right, I'll bring to its service my skill, like what I've been educated to do, the things that I know how to do, from the most basic, like putting together a sentence, to the more complex, like, sort of resonating ideas and building structures, and all these other technical elements that go into composing a coherent work. And so I essentially worked as a scribe or an apprentice to a storyteller
Mhm.
who was unveiling the story for me. And part of my job as this apprentice included, besides the writing, included actually reading a great deal, reading a lot of history, um, doing the work of recalling a great deal. And sometimes I even called older relative members, older family members. There you go, older relatives or family
Mhm.
members, uh, when my memory wasn't quite certain about something, because I think, well, is what I'm writing true to the nature of the story, or am I just sort of, am I just like BSing essentially, right? The story of the chicken and the hawk, this one was really, really interesting because to me, it reads like a soap opera. It really does, right? And I thought, so this 5-year-old girl has this soap opera going off in her head, and it follows her for years. Like she keeps coming back to the same opera over and over and over again. Um, and she experiences it as if these were real people, right? She doesn't experience them as iconic animals, right, or folktale creatures. She experiences the life of the chicken and the hawk as if they were real people. And upon reflection, I realized, well, that is how it would seem to a 5-year-old, right? Like it wouldn't, they wouldn't make the distinction about this is real or that isn't. So coming full circle to answer your question, when I'm surprised, and Julia has often had a lot to say that surprises me, as has Karen. But when I'm surprised by what readers say, it feels to me like I'm the scribe who is once again learning something else, that the storyteller was saying, that I was so busy like doing the work that I didn't realize the storyteller was saying, right? I was so busy doing the research and doing the spell check and and
Mhm.
editing the text, that I didn't pay attention. And doing these talks with you guys, it gives me a chance not only to reread the book, and like I told Karen and Julia last time, to discover things when I reread it, but it also gives me a chance in hearing from other readers to see perspectives that I'm not privy to, because every reader brings something to the text that I don't think an individual writer or scribe or even author can imbue it with, right? I will repeat one thing that I said last time. A book is just an object, right? Just like a music score is just paper with some markings on it. But the moment a reader opens it and
Yeah.
starts reading it, that's when the reader actually inspires life into it, right? They breathe life into it, because that world starts taking form and movement in the reader's mind. And, based on what Julia just said, her personal experience has so shaped how she receives the story of Rosie and the cat. And it's really interesting. The mechanics are there. There's a mirror, there's a cat, there's a little girl, and there's this multiplied world. Because the text just says this suddenly multiplied world. But I didn't have the experience myself personally to see what Julia just told us that she sees, right? To see that melding of identity between the cat and the little girl, the fact that even the way the story is told in this fragmented way, in essence, is that fragmented mirroring, which is such a beautiful image. Just, yeah.
Well, this is fascinating to me because, with all due respect to cat lovers, I'm not one.
Mhm.
Me
I
neither.
think the cat's a jerk. You know, I read this very
I
early.
like dogs though.
Yeah, you know, the cats are jerks, and I'm fascinated. And I'm going to go back to this chapter because now I've got another way of looking at it through what Julia said.
Mhm.
Otherwise, I saw this as just another damn cat. And what surprised me was how viciously Maya got torn up.
Mhm.
I wondered where that came from.
Mhm.
And then the tenderness with which Alex takes care of her.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering, is she feeling, does she know this tenderness?
Mhm.
Does she, can she feel Alex's concern?
Mhm.
Or is this just part of how she knows her life, is she's always kind of been carried along?
Mhm.
I didn't go deep into this chapter at all. And when it came to the hawk and the chicken, it's like, okay. You know, here's some story time. So I'm really interested in going back to this. But at some point, I want to explore more your writing process.
Mhm. Mhm.
And since you were almost channeling this thing, did
Mhm.
you actually do a storyboard? Did you actually peg characters together and this and that? And at some point, I want to know how you built this, unless you were just channeling. So I'm going to have to rely on Julia's insight on this chapter.
I'm very puzzled by in the oral tale
Mhm.
you have Gweno,
Mhm.
who instead it's her husband who ends up wearing her clothes.
Mhm.
So he becomes, you know, a transvestite.
Mhm. Mhm.
And also there's this poor problem with the hawk,
Mhm.
because he is not being able to marry and have children. So
Mhm.
you've got this whole sort of sexual drama going on, the two aspects of the story.
Mhm.
I'm
And I
definitely going back to this chapter.
I felt so sorry for Gweno when she realized she can't fit into these gorgeous clothes because she's about to lay her eggs. I mean, there were some wonderful touches there. But to go back
Uh-huh.
to the wildcat, to
Mhm.
Rosie,
Mhm.
I've been living this drama with uh, the Roma, as you know, were slaves longer than Afro Americans. They were enslaved before Columbus reached America
Mhm.
here in Europe.
Mhm.
And then they were in the Holocaust.
Mhm.
And this couple, they had their 4 children all
Mhm.
taken violently by the police from them.
Mhm.
And when they came to me, they were like wildcats. They were feral. They were
Mhm.
impossible.
Mhm.
And now, because of the kind of Alex kindness,
Mhm.
they are the most wonderful people.
Mhm. Mhm.
So there is that possibility of change.
Mhm.
Yonel now, he wants to be a pastor.
Mhm.
They've gone through this wonderful religious conversion, which
Mhm.
with the singing of the Pentecostal and so forth, and this kindness that they
Mhm.
show
Mhm.
to people who are worse off than
Mhm.
themselves when
Mhm.
they are at a very, very low level economically and so forth.
Mhm.
That I see their capacity for empathy,
Mhm.
and that's grown, and it's healing me to see that,
Mhm.
to see this capacity for change,
Mhm.
for healing.
Mhm.
And I I think what you're doing with Rain is showing all of these aspects. Um, and you're talking now, I didn't register Esther as being particularly interesting. And then when you pointed out you were going to be writing the next book on her, then I saw this quiet empathy that she has. And this is something I'm thinking very much about at the moment, these dreadful relationships that happen if you've got a psychopath and an empath together,
Oh my gosh.
which becomes extremely destructive. And so I find this book absolutely, well, it's not only talking about these problems amongst individuals, but it's also dealing with the whole trauma of colonialism and so forth. And it's a very, very important book. Thank you for writing it.
I haven't read the book, of course, but Karen mentioned some, channeling. So, I don't know if you know Zizek. You know Zizek.
Zizek, no.
He's a philosopher. He's kind of like a modern day philosopher. I think he's from Yugoslavia, but he's kind of interesting person. So he always, it's as if writers in general are kind of like prophets in a way. Like when he wants to understand what's going on in a country, he says he goes like incognito in that country and he just watches the kind of movies that are going on and the kind whatever people are writing about in that time.
The stories they're telling about themselves.
The stories they're telling. So like this story, I haven't read it yet, but you're writing it now. Are there aspects of it that are reflective of what's going on now? You're here in the US when you're writing this story, right?
Yes.
And what's going on in the world? I mean, can you feel that? Because it seems as if Zizek is able to diagnose what's going on by reading whatever people are writing at that time, the kind of stories that they are telling.
I think
so when she talked about channeling, that's to me, it's as if there's this aspect of writers, poets even, how they can just say a sentence that kind of captures exactly what's going on in that time and in that time point.
Didn't I tell you what you were writing? It sounded like 2020.
Oh, see?
Yeah, Elizabeth, that's absolutely
right. Yeah, Zizek is correct. So now I'm really going to read this book.
Yes. In fact, Karen quoted one line. I remember in one of her posts, and when she was in the process of reading it, Karen would post, every once in a while a comment or a question, an exclamation mark. And one day she posted something from it was one of the later books. It was it was from Olo's meeting with Maya at the very, very end, when Maya realizes a train is not just a train, right? A train is a derangement of elements that disrupts the natural rhythm of life, right? And Karen quoted that line and she says, "Yep, sounds like 2020."
Yeah, so that's really interesting that you saw that, because I haven't even read the book, but I would be looking for 2020 things in it,
Yeah. I will say this much. So the book came out on April 15th, right? It was done by last fall. I'd completed everything last fall, and then we went through the editing and proofreading and all of the official stuff that you have to do to make it available to readers. So I remember at the time, because I was trained as a medieval literary scholar. I specialize in the medieval literature of the Romance languages of Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and French. And the Middle Ages that I cover is between, say, roughly 10th, 11th century to about 14th century or so. My specialization is specifically on Dante, right, and his contemporaries, and he was on the sort of he straddled the end of the 1200s and the beginning of the 1300s, right? But the reason I bring all of this up is because my formal education as a literary scholar, because of the period that I studied, it meant also studying um, a millennium of literature that preceded it very, very intensely, right? So since I focused on a 1300 scholar, everything from St. Augustine on, from 350 AD on, was incredibly important. But even more so, go back another 500 years, right, to the classical poets of Rome, right, the Augustan poets, the poets who the Emperor Augustus is important is I guess responsible for having patronized and encouraged the poets who inspired Dante, who's my principal point of interest in medieval poetry. So that entire body of work from poets and philosophers alike, which then sort of hopscotches you back another couple of thousand years or another couple of I don't know, centuries or millennia, whatever, into classical Greek literature. So the idea here is that my education necessarily meant mining consistently backwards in time in this Greco-Roman Catholic tradition quite intensely, even though I hadn't thought that's what I would be doing. I thought I would be focusing on a poet, and I realized it was an entire universe, an entire millennium and a half of
Yes.
poetry. And
Dante is a whole library of
oh
texts.
my God, an entire
Within
universe
the
of it,
text.
really. And
Mm.
so in my formal education, um, the 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 things that inform how I formulate thoughts formally is that body of work, right? But my origin is East African from Kenya with this entire other universe, right, of storytelling to go by. So when it came to and I'm the all of this context I'm laying to talk about the issue of channeling, right? What are you channeling as a writer? So when it came time to write Rain, I remember, like I said, like I told you guys earlier, it was my great grandmother that I was listening to. It is she whose voice I wanted to share with the world. And yet, all of the tools, all of the formal tools that I'd been provided with came from this millennium and a half of Greco-Roman sort of Catholic liturgical tradition. So those are the tools that I used. And in the process of mining those tools, in the process of learning how to use them, here's what I realized, Elizabeth, which I think applies very much to what this philosopher is saying. Dante, for example, and I'll use him just as one example. If you read Dante today, you could substitute out all of the historical figures that he mentions, who are Florentine or French or biblical or what have you. You could pluck each one of those historical figures out and replace them with a contemporary figure today who fits the exact same profile, and you'd have exactly the same poem in terms of its philosophical and its ethical significance, right? Julia, this is why I often get into trouble with fellow Dante scholars when I say the historicizing, like the zeal to historicize the Commedia is I think over is overstated, it's
Right,
overdone
right. Do you have
because
Dennis
it's
Looney's book,
uh,
Freedom Readers?
no, not yet. Let me just finish this
Thank
idea first, and then we'll come back to Looney. But
you.
but the idea of reading a poem that was written in the 1300s as only having to do with the 1300s is
Yeah, no, that's
completely
wrong.
mistaken, because
Mhm,
poetry is not history.
mhm,
History is, as Aristotle says, the specific, right? The specific in place, in person, in time, right? In activity. This person in this place did this at this time, right?
mhm,
And then it's about sort of weaving together a narrative of cause and effect and trying to make sense out of it in that sense. But poetry is different. Poetry, again, as Aristotle says, juxtaposing with history, is universalizing, it's philosophizing. It is a place where we inquire about what our human experience signifies, right? What does it mean to encounter certain situations? What does it mean to be a responsible citizen? What does it mean to be an irresponsible citizen? What is justice? What is love? These are philosophical questions. These are theological questions. These are abstractions that cannot be weighed or measured, and yet that occupy our everyday existence. And because they cannot be weighed and measured, they cannot be the province of science, right? Which is about weighing and measuring the empirical. And they're not the province of history because they're not just about punctual events in our lives or once upon a time I loved and I'm trying to understand what that particular experience meant. No, it's like I have loved. What does love mean? What is love? Right? What does it signify that it has been transformed into something else? What does it signify that it has transformed me and that I am different? Any woman, any man, I would include even, who has had a child undergoes a transformation that mystifies them because suddenly a world where they were the center completely shifts in axis and their child becomes the center, the well-being of the child, and not just in terms of survival but thriving, happiness, all these things that they, in retrospect, wanted for themselves, suddenly they want for this other person. And for me, this is one of the best examples when it is a healthy and nurturing relationship. It's one of the most beautiful examples of the transformative power of love. It's something that cannot be experienced until it's experienced. It cannot be explained. It cannot be quantified. And this is the purview of poetry, right? And so to wrap it all up, I knew that what I had, the concrete things that I had to bring to the table were my knowledge and education about how to put a text together. From the most basic, like I said, of writing to the more complex of really sitting back and looking at how everything worked together. Now, back to I think this is a great opportunity to segue into Karen's question about like what's your writing process, and I'll only give just a little bit about my attitude about it, right? Maybe not approach, but my attitude about it. When I did my dissertation, my doctoral dissertation, I wanted a concrete topic, something practical that I knew I would have a starting point and an ending point. However, the question I asked was anything but contained. I was wondering how Dante um, had designed the structure, like the textual structure of the Divine Comedy. I wanted to know how did he put this poem together in such a perfect way, right? This is not really a question that's often asked. And when it is asked, it's asked in a very sort of broad bird's eye perspective. And the other thing about Dante is for 700 years, because the text has been around for 700 years, for 700 years, scholars said anybody who tries to figure out or articulate how Dante uh, structured or designed the Divine Comedy is running a fool's errand because it's incomprehensible. Like it cannot be articulated. It's too vast. We can't perceive it or contain it in our own minds. So I had that on one hand, but then at the same time, I had the poet's voice in my ear, a voice that's very meticulous, very precise, and incredibly economical in the way he uses language. Someone who, in 3 words, can embody an entire universe, like, is someone to be reckoned with, right? So I remember thinking to myself, someone this meticulous couldn't possibly have just been sort of going with the flow and channeling this brilliant composition, which ends up being perfectly structured. Like, where was his active involvement in the creation of the structure? Like, is it visible? Can we actually see it? And so from that process, which was like about maybe a 5 or 6 year process of studying this question and analyzing the poem very meticulously, what I learned was that human effort, like purposeful human effort that goes into creating something, can be regulated, and it can be called to service in a very intentional way, right? So if I'm working as a writer, it's not enough to just sit there and wait for inspiration, wait for the muses to whisper in my ears so that I write what they have to say, right? But rather, just as Dante said before he wrote the Commedia, when he said, like, I study meticulously, endlessly for hours on end, because I want to write of this lady, Beatrice, that which has never been written about any other woman. And then 25 years later, we have the completed Commedia. And when you study his text, you realize that everything that he studied, like the different disciplines from the liberal arts, right, which is rhetoric, logic, argumentation, music, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, you can actually see evidence of that knowledge being brought to bear in the composition of the text, but also in the construction of meaning within the text, right? Like the packaging of these nuggets that the reader might receive and breathe life into. And so this poet then became the model for me, right? It became the model for me in the sense that I realized, so there's this story that I want to tell that is inspired by the way my great grandmother tells stories. But I also have this guide, right? This master poetic composer who tells me that if you're going to do a good job, you'd better roll up your sleeves and get your technical skills to work for you. You'd better refine your ability to recognize that the music of the sentence works. You better refine your ability to step back from the text and go, these echoes resonate well. These dissonances have the effect that they should have. This violence feels violent. This beauty feels beautiful. Like that is something that, at least in my experience, and I may be limited here, that is something that the intellect has to be responsible for overseeing, right? Your technical skill has to be responsible for overseeing. So with rain, for example, Karen, you were asking, like, did I have a sort of a storyboard that I then followed? It was a hybrid of both, because in a sense, you know, the epigraph that I have at the beginning of St. Augustine, talking about, I'm about to sing a song, and before I begin actually singing the song, the entire song is before me, right? I haven't sung a single note, right? And this is at the very epigraph of the book. And the moment I start singing the first note, the note being sang in my throat is the present. And when I move on to the next note, that next note becomes a present, and the one I just sang becomes the past. So the note I've sung goes into memory, while the note I'm on is my present, and the rest of the unsung song is still waiting. It's in that unsung future, right? And so here I am. It's almost as if the song were moving through me, and I'm moving through the song in time, right? And then he concludes by saying, when I reach that final note, that song, which once upon a time was all future, and then gradually, step by step, became my present, is now all in memory. We went from anticipation to experience to memory, right? To recollection. And so for rain, that is the experience that I had of rain, of knowing that there's this song that I'm listening to and transcribing, and I see the song, like I know what it entails. But at each step of the way, the details of particular moments sometimes would surprise me, because while it was in an unsung future, I didn't have a clear perspective on it. But the moment I'm in the moment writing it, then I can see it so much more clearly. And I see details that I was like, oh, I had no idea that that felt that way. For example, Maya's name. I didn't know where Maya's name came from. until the moment Alex responds to Mamma Akoth. And I was like, oh, you mean that's where she got her name from? You know, from a mishearing of an infant in the sense, like in the classical sense of the word, of someone who doesn't yet speak. Because until the moment he speaks Maya's name, Alex never says a word. He hums, he maybe, sort of makes sounds, but it's not the moment until he claims Maya by saying Mara, which is a Luo word for mine. But because he's never spoken before, he can't pronounce R. So it comes out Maya. And Mamma Akoth takes that as, oh, this is the child's name, Maya, right? And then the other ancestors who give her the name Anyango. So those moments like that, like I'll be writing and I go, oh, whoa, I did not know that, So to me, it's interesting. I don't know how other writers write, and I'm loath to call myself either an author or even a writer per se, like in the sort of the classical way we think about writers or authors, simply because I'm aware of my role as a listener and a scribe, right? And I think it's important for me to maintain this awareness, because if I were to lose sight of it, and I've actually experienced this, when I lost sight of my role as scribe and I started trying to make the story do something, it just didn't work. Like it felt clunky and forced, and I was like, that rings false. And when I looked at why it rang false, I realized it rang false because I was trying to do something clever, right? I was trying to be like, oh, you know what? I've got all this education, all this training. I can like use it to make the story sound really cool. And then I'd read and go, that does not sound cool at all, because that's my ego trying to turn it into something that it's not. Karen, I have no idea if that helps at all, but
now my question would be, whose scribe are you?
This is a good question, and I think maybe this relates to what
I think the answer to that is that it's her soul.
Huh.
Okay.
Poetry is soul talk. History is body talk. The
Yeah.
physical world, time and space and armies and kings. But especially dream vision poems of the Middle Ages, that was where you had a guide who would lead you and educate you and refine your soul. And I had Ron Hertzman asked me to be part of a group that spoke in Attica State Prison on Dante. And in my talk, I mentioned how the souls in hell blame everyone else but themselves. And one man said, yes, that was me. This was from the result of the 12-step program in Attica State Prison. I thought to myself, none of my students at Princeton or at Berkeley would have said that. That the black prisoner was wiser and better than the educated white students. And because what Dante is doing is teaching us humility as he learns it himself in text, and he doesn't have it in hell. It's not got there yet. I mentioned Dennis Looney because he came, one who told me that Frederick Douglass visited here. And he came because Frances Trollope is buried here. She went up the Mississippi River, saw slavery firsthand before Queen Victoria was on the throne, absolutely hated it, wrote a wonderful novel against slavery, which we've just published again with the Trollope Society, Jonathan Jefferson Whitlaw. You can get it on Amazon, unfortunately. And she got to Cincinnati and she did waxworks of Dante's Commedia on the American frontier to teach the frontiers people. And the young man whom she got to do this, he was part Native American, Hiram Powers. And he then came to Florence and became a wonderful professor of sculpture at the Accademia di Belle Arti. And his major work is The Greek Slave, which was a very strong statement. It was at the center of Crystal Palace exhibition in 1851, and it's a statement against slavery. But what Dennis Looney was doing in his book called Freedom Readers was speaking about how important Dante is in the Black community, and with these various chapters, because Dante speaks to everyone, because he is speaking to souls, not just to where you are in your social status or your level of education. I find the Roma respond, although they're illiterate, to Dante. Everyone can respond to Dante. And I love the way you've structured this with cantos, like Dante's comedies. And Dante's playing games because Solomon writes the Song of Songs, the canto, canticles, and so forth. And then Dante copies that. And then at the very last 100th canto, it begins with St. Bernard singing about the Virgine Madre Figlio del tuo Figlio, which Bernard writes nowhere. He would have been writing in Latin in Gregorian chant. Instead, it's Dante composing a Franciscan lauda in the Volgare for Bernard to say, which still undoes Bernard. But what's really happening, Bernard wrote a very lengthy commentary on the Song of Solomon, Song of Songs. So Dante is playing these games, and you are too, of this as the Song of Songs. And it is, it's more than a love story, because the love story part is a rather violent one, but it's a story of women giving birth, and good births and bad births and so forth. And it's a topic which normally the men don't do because of their experience. But it's wonderful to have this with all of those layers of education. Upstairs I have the library with all the books for Dante, beginning with the Greek and the Latin, and then Brunetta Latino, his teacher, whom I work with, and then Dante. All of those layers, but you've given equal time to the oral storytelling, to the African, as well as the Euro-American, and that is the way it should be. Thank you.
Interesting.
I love listening to these the way you weave these different ideas together. I would love to be able to I'd love to be able to, and I think this is why Zamani Chronicles exists, which is the publisher for Rain, right? I'd love to be able to hear the stories of other like unheard voices.
Right.
So Elizabeth, you're also from Kenya, and you know what a
Yes.
rich tradition. You know, I always made the joke when I first went to Italy that
Yes.
I was in Perugia at the time when I first went as an undergraduate student, and it felt like you know those coffee table books of art, of classical art, you know,
That's
like
right.
art masterpieces. I'd only
Yeah.
ever seen them in doctors' offices and in like you know office waiting rooms, and they're always really beautiful catalogs of like the David sculpture and you know the Botticelli Aphrodite and all that. But they're always just sort of like really pretty pictures, even when you see them at
Right.
school. But then living in Italy, it's like they're
Italy is not
suddenly
people of the
they're
book.
they're part of the landscape, and the book
And
came
no,
alive.
I found it such a paradox because when I would be working in libraries with manuscripts of Dante and so forth,
Hmm
the scholars would be telling me they hated Dante.
Yes, yes.
And, I was so upset because, if you hate your major poet who is your soul,
Hmm.
what's gone wrong? And then I was living as a hermit in the countryside. And the
Uh-huh.
contadini, the peasants, they know Dante by heart.
They
They
know,
sing
and they
Wow.
and
sing
they
Dante.
adore him. And,
Mhm.
they give him a voice.
Yes, yes.
So I've recorded one of them
Mhm.
reading the entire Commedia before he died. And it's
Mhm.
on the web.
Mhm.
And he reads it cantastoria.
Right, right. Oh,
And then the
fantastic.
scholars,
Uh-huh.
instead, they read it, oh,
Right.
goes,
So,
Da,
so
da,
why
da, right.
so
why
why
the
is
school
that? Sorry.
turned off, because they haven't understood its soul literature. They think of it as the literature of the intellect only.
They think of this poetry as archival material, right?
That's right.
They
Mhm.
think that they think that the text on the page is the thing, not
Mhm.
realizing that that is
Mhm.
simply a conduit for creating a new life experience. It's
Yeah.
a conduit for giving voice to our experience of
Mhm.
life, right? And this is why I was saying earlier, I get in trouble every time I talk about how overzealous the historicizing critics
Yeah.
are,
And
right?
also how shallow it is.
Yes, because
It has no depth.
critic Elizabeth will say something like, "Oh, in this canto where Dante meets Pierre de Vigne was a scribe who worked as a secretary of the emperor, and he was also a very renowned lawyer." And they'd go into this whole entire biography about this man without noticing that actually all Dante is interested in is
Mhm.
what Pierre de Vigne is saying in that moment about his
Yes.
experience, right? The fact that he's saying um, that he was so consumed with self-regard and
Right.
self-love
And when he
that
lost his job,
when he couldn't get affirmation from others or external affirmation of his greatness, then he preferred to kill himself. You know what
yeah.
I mean? Like this very, very solipsistic
Mhm.
sort of, and they lose all of that because they're so busy talking about how he was a scribe and he published this and he published that. So scholars,
And
scholars
they
of that
don't,
nature
yes, they
tend to
don't
lose
parallel
sight of the
him.
poetry.
They don't parallel him to Romeo,
So then,
who in
so the
who
reason,
is
so the reason, so the reason why the ordinary person understand Dante is because he's talking about their just human experience, probably.
Yes,
yes,
exactly,
yes.
So,
exactly.
It's his own
and
experience. He's been exiled, and he changes that into pilgrimage in the poem. He does this marvelous alchemy with his own soul, which had been absolutely shattered because when you were exiled in the Middle Ages, you were also excommunicated. So,
so
therefore, he has figures in the poem who are excommunicated, but their souls are saved because the
yeah. So
church
then,
doesn't have the last word, God does.
Mhm.
so then, in reality, is that these things are when a good writer is writing just about their feelings,
Mhm.
human beings haven't changed. We
Yes,
still have pain is pain, happiness
in
is happiness,
exactly.
and with a range of reactions we have to any anything that happens, those parameters are the same,
Yes,
because our biology hasn't
Yes.
actually changed.
Mhm.
So there's
exactly,
some
exactly.
advantage actually. So for me, I come from, in terms of even physiology, those things are constant. And
Mhm.
so
Exactly.
there are certain situations that will always bring out, of course, a writer knows how to describe that, but
Mhm.
it's the same thing if a mother dies or you lose your cat or whatever.
Yes, yes.
That feeling is the same whether it happened 1,000 years or now.
Exactly.
And so if a poet or a writer can capture that feeling, it will
Mhm.
be familiar to someone who's it's happening to them now.
Yes, yes.
So in that way, so then I think academics are too focused on the words and the
Mhm.
structure of the words. So
Mhm.
sometimes
Mhm.
they
Mhm. Mhm.
more removed from actually just actual life.
Mm-hmm,
And then
mm-hmm.
it takes on, when they're interpreting things, it's another thing altogether they've created that they're chasing. And sometimes it's really far removed from real life.
Yes, exactly. Exactly, Elizabeth. That's exactly the problem right there. And here's an irony, right? At least with respect to my experience. When I was doing my dissertation, I chose Dante because of how much I just loved his poetry, how much I recognized. Okay, so the thing about Dante that spoke to me most is that he asks those questions, or he puts into words those questions which I had been sort of conditioned to believe one shouldn't ask, right?
Yeah.
Questions about justice, right? Like, what is justice and what is divine justice? How can God be fair if God allows certain things to happen, right? How can one say that some kind of love is right and some kind of love is wrong, right? um, why is it that some people, no matter how terrible they are, right, they still somehow manage to skate through life, apparently, whereas some people, no matter how kind and generous and wonderful they are, their life is just compounded with suffering. So these really difficult questions, as you grow up as a child, and I grew up in parochial schools, which were very heavy with religious teaching. I found myself, just not out of any like willful contrariness, just curiosity, wondering things like, wait a second. Oh, I remember my first one in catechism. I asked this question, and it saw an end to my catechism process. I asked the priest, when we were talking about, they have this schema where they have how do you say, a chasm, a cliff on one side and a cliff on the other side, and a chasm in between. And one cliff is called God, and the other cliff is called man, right? And they say that the way they formulate this is, at the beginning, man and God were one, but then original sin created this chasm.
So then they're
And
giving you a Rift Valley.
well, something like that. And then
Yeah.
they say, and then they proceed to tell you that, but then God promised that he would bring, like through the sacrament, he would reunite this severed bond. And he did that through Christ. And then the picture that they show you of a cross, sort of creating a bridge between the two chasms, right? The cross of Christ having died. My question when we were going through this lesson was, okay, I understand the idea of the story, but I don't understand, you know, between the time Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, right, and the time Christ was born, generations upon generations of human beings were born and died one after another. So what happened to them since Christ tarried so long in coming and getting crucified and creating this bridge? Like, what happened? I was asking this question at 13 years old, and the priest was not very happy about it, because he was like, well, it doesn't matter. This, like, the ways of God are mysterious, and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then there were other questions on top of that, because when one question remains unanswered, usually its answer generates new questions, right? But if it remains unanswered, then there are all these sort of pending, unarticulated questions that are just sort of waiting around. And I realized at the end that, as much as I wanted to participate in the communion, right, in the religious community, there's the things that the priest was saying did not make sense in a way that just created too much conflict. Like, it prevented me from moving forward. So it wasn't that I was trying to look for a reason to contradict the religious doctrine. It's just that the answers I got were, for lack of a better word, just like they're vacuous. They just telling me, well, this is divine mystery and we just have to have faith and accept it, just did not work. But fast forward, and I'm an undergrad, and I'm reading the fourth canto of Inferno, and Dante asks exactly that question. What happened to all the souls who died before Christ came? And he gets an explanation. And I realize, wait a second, that story is actually in the Bible. The explanation he's given is actually in the Bible. And so I found myself wondering, why didn't the priest just tell me the story in the Bible to answer my question? I think he would have,
Which part of how is it explained in the Bible again?
I believe it's in Acts. It's one of Paul's letters where he talks about the harrowing of hell, like that when Christ, or maybe it's in John. I think it's John, where when Christ dies, there's the curtain in the temple is rent, right? And the earth splits open, right? And Christ is gone for 3 days, and on the third day he rises again. And I believe it's Paul who elaborates that during that time, Christ went down into the depths of hell, brought all these righteous souls, and brought them, basically saved them, salvaged all these souls that had just been waiting for this moment, and then took them up to heaven with him. So that's the story that Dante initially tells. And so I was like, well, why didn't the priest just say that? Because he could have very easily, but that aside, leave it alone. The deeper
maybe he didn't have the education. I mean, some of this stuff.
Yes, exactly. Which means that he is responsible for my education, and yet he doesn't have adequate education to actually take on that responsibility.
In Florence, in San Marco, which is just down the street from here, Fra Angelico paints the Annunciation. You come up the stairs where the monks sleep, and there's this beautiful scene of the Annunciation. And then you walk just a little further, and there's a cell, and inside it is Fra Angelico's painting of the harrowing of hell. And Eve is the same model as that for Mary at the Annunciation. Eva Ave. And you've got Christ harrowing all of the good souls out of hell, Adam and Eve and Enoch and all of the others. And the poor devil, he's underneath the door which is smashed down on him. And he's he's behaving like Rosie the cat. It's a wonderful scene because Fra Angelico, he really understood how to picture scripture in beautiful ways. For instance, the architecture that he paints is the same as the cloister. So it's as if the Last Supper and everything is happening in Florence in this moment in time, not so many centuries earlier.
You know what's really interesting, Elizabeth, about this question is like one might go, well, that was an easy fix, right? But here's a follow-up question, because Dante does not let this go. Like I said, that first instance is sort of resolved in the fourth canto. Now there are 100 cantos, just to make it clear for you the context, and they're all roughly the same length. So already in the fourth canto, he's kind of already resolved this question that I had as a 13-year-old. And I'm thinking, oh, I didn't know that. Later on, he elaborates a little bit further, right? Like as he descends further down into hell, you get more details about this scene but through the mouth of an actual devil who says, well, this figure came down who was marked by triumph, and he took all these souls with him. So there's a sort of reiterative sort of storytelling that reaffirms the Bible story, right? But here's the rub, and here's a more difficult question. Much later, not in Inferno and not in Purgatory, which are both terrestrial realms, but in heaven itself, when faced with the souls that symbolize justice, right? Dante now gets to articulate through the voice of these souls who are wise and can see everything. He gets to articulate the most difficult question, which is basically this: if heaven is the realm of the blessed and only Christians may get into heaven, right? where is the justice? Where's the divine justice that, say, there's someone who's lived their lives in a place in the world? In this particular case, he gives an example of the Ganges, right, which was imagined being in India to be the farthest place you could imagine, right? So someone is born on the banks of the Ganges or the Indus. He lives a completely virtuous life, right? This is a good and generous person. And yet he never gets to hear the story of the life of Jesus Christ. He never gets to receive the mythology of the salvation or the crucifixion, right? He never gets baptized. And therefore, according to all these criteria, hearing about Christ, believing the mythology, and then getting baptized, he doesn't become a Christian.
But you just told the story that Jesus, there's a whole bunch of people who died before Christ.
Now, this is someone who died.
Hold on. And when Christ died, he went and brought those people and took them to heaven. Those people never heard of Christ. So why does that same thing apply to what you're saying right now?
That's right.
Wait, hang on a second, Julia. Why doesn't it apply?
It does. I think it does, because I think it's in Romans somewhere. There are certain laws of God that are written in people's hearts.
Well, let me finish the scenario, and then we can discuss it. So he's asking this question, and now he's concerned not so much about people who lived historically, like before Christ was born, right? Maybe he's concerned about contemporaries, right? So say there's a tribe right now who lives in Papua New Guinea, for example, who have never come across missionaries, right? Who have never opened the Bible, who've never, et cetera, et cetera. So it's that kind of example. And yet among them, there might be people who are completely virtuous. And the question Dante has is, if what we are taught is that you have to know the story of trust, you have to have known the story of Christ and believe it, therefore have faith, and then be baptized as a Christian in order to enter the kingdom of heaven, what about these people who never had the practical opportunity to become Christians in that way? You see how he's framed his question? Yeah. He's very specific about the way he's framed his question. Why? Because there are people who are insisting that you have to have that kind of practical bona fides. You have to be a card-carrying member of the Christian religion to get into heaven. That's what they were insisting on.
But they are wrong. I think that they are wrong. I think there's a certain, I believe that there's a certain, okay, God is just, and he's the one who has created the whole earth. And he knows where everybody is. And so Christ has paid for the price of people's sins. Nobody is being let into heaven because of anything that they have actually done. So there's something called grace. And that grace, there are some people who are going to have the privilege. Everyone lives for a very short time, 50 to 70 years if you're lucky. And there's a very high chance that some people in that span of 50 to 70 years, they never get to hear about Christ.
Exactly.
So those people, they're not all going to go to hell. I think there are people who are they're going to be judged by how much they knew. And I think that there are certain things that everybody is born with. Like, I think is it in Romans where Paul says that there's no excuse, that everybody kind of has a knowledge of God to some extent. Like each person actually knows what justice is. Justice is not, you're not taught justice. There's a level at which you're taught justice, but there's a level at which you know what justice is. Everybody does. Like, what is a fair way to treat people? What is cruel? What is cruelty? What is all this stuff? There's a level at which every human being knows that thing. And so I think that God has the capacity to go beyond. We cannot confine God and say, oh, it's like this. I think justice is going to be justice. And there's going to be many people in heaven who other people are going to be very surprised that they are there.
That's what Dante says.
And so Elizabeth, you're saying exactly what Dante says.
Yes.
But it's true.
So my point in this story being that if you had been my teacher, during my catechism, You would have explained these things to me. But the experience of the teachers that I had, the priests that I met, did not have the wherewithal to look at things in terms of justice is justice. They were dogmatic, and they were incredibly restrictive and exclusive in their conception of what Christian is. And this is something that you see all over the world, right? There are people who will tell you that unless you know the Bible and you accept Jesus Christ as your personal savior in your heart, you are doomed to hell. And they will mean it when they say that, right? But what Dante is saying is that no, divine justice is not constrained by the laws of man, right? He's basically saying that the divine justice, and I think Julie and I talked about this before, the example that he gives, because he ends up answering the question by example, right? The example that Dante gives to sort of illustrate an example of someone who did not hear the word of Christ, did not know the Bible, was not baptized, and did not go through any of the rituals or experiences that are supposed to make you a Christian, is a fictional character from a pagan poem, right? So this boggles the mind because the poet has set up a situation where there is no way to redeem a fictional character in a pagan poem that was written in a time predating the birth of Christ, right? So how does Dante manage to have that soul be among the just in heaven? Well, he does by having that man there. You look at the character's profile. His name is Rufus, right? You look at how he appears in the poem and you realize that passage, I think it's from John, I can't remember what chapter it is. It's either 12 or 25, but it's the one where Christ is washing the apostles' feet and they're about to have the Last Supper and they are asking him questions about how they should be. And his instruction to them is, my new commandment to you is to love others as I have loved you, right? For there's no greater love can there be than for a man to lay down his life for another, right? And this is in a nutshell his definition of what it is to live the kind of life that he is, to be a Christian, imago Christi. Be willing to forego everything, every comfort, even life, for the well-being of another. And when you look at this fictional character, this pagan fictional character, that's exactly what he embodies. And a moment when their home is in grave danger, when people are running for their lives, he's called to defend, and he doesn't ask any questions. He drops everything, he defends his home, his burning city, and he dies in the process. And so this is a figure who embodies exactly that passage from John, right? And Dante has essentially answered the question by saying exactly what you were saying, that if someone can live the exemplar without needing the instruction of the Bible, right? Because he says the voice of God is in the wind, there to be heard by whomever has the ears to hear it.
But also in our spirit too.
Exactly. That's essentially what he's talking about, right? The wind as it's in the soul of the world. And those who don't want to hear it won't hear it, even when they have an instruction manual like the Bible telling them, right? If they don't want to hear it, they won't hear it. But there are many, in fact, who will hear it and will live by that example no matter what. Now, the reason why this is so important, at least for me, and I think also really, really important, when with respect to any kind of formal dogmatic religion, is that the nature of dogmatic institutions is that they want their laws and their rules to be the model that you follow. That if you don't follow our rules, then you're lost, right? Forgetting that their rules aren't about them. The divine direction, right? Divine will is something that is available by grace for everyone, and there shouldn't be these gatekeepers and conditions and all these artificial things that human beings put in place to say that if you don't follow this obstacle course and pass it, then you don't get in.
But
right?
the one thing though about, because I mean, there's a whole bunch of people in the Old Testament who they're going to be in heaven. They were righteous, but still Christ has paid for everyone. So that's the thing about Christ, is that Christ has paid. There's a cost of there's a price for redemption of the soul, whether it's from the original sin or whatever it is. There is
I understand.
Christ has paid for it. Now, how? So even the people who've never heard of Christ, who he's going to redeem, he's going to redeem some because they've lived by this natural law. They were able to connect to God actually without knowing Christ, because they were able to listen to whatever their soul is telling them, whatever the Spirit of God is saying in the wind or whatever it is. They're able to hear that voice and they're able to live that life that makes them pass or whatever it is. But in passing, there's still, in the Bible, no one can actually get there on their own. And that's why Christ died.
Let me just say, we get into. I will preface this by saying that I hear what you're saying, and I understand that you're articulating your faith, right?
Yes.
You're articulating your faith. Having said that, and I say this most respectfully, I'm very wary of the formulation of questions of damnation or redemption in such transactional terms. I'm very wary of the idea that redemption came at a price, and that price was the death of Christ. And that this is a price that God paid so that the scales might be balanced. I'm very wary of that, because it's completely, just in a very fundamental way, it completely undermines and negates the very idea of grace, because grace and love and grace is not transactional. It's not a commodity. It's not something there for the exchange. Grace is there for the taking, for those who wish it. And so one of the things for me, like, because I told you guys all my life, like as a child, as a teenager, all my life, every single year when Easter came around and I heard the story about how I think the creed goes, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, so that whoever might believe might be saved, and whoever doesn't might perish, right? Or in eternal damnation, what have you. And this juxtaposition, this framing of divine will in such materially transactional terms never made sense to me, and it troubled me deeply. And so I thought to myself, I don't understand how people can say God is love and the love of God is offered by grace, but unless you do all these things, then let me finish the thought, please. Allow me to finish the thought, please. That unless you do all these things, then you haven't earned it. How is it that you're supposed to earn something that is there for the taking by grace? I don't understand that.
Actually, I understand what you're saying. And I think that when you come from the point of view that if you believe what is in the Bible, or even what even Paul is saying in all those books of the New Testament, there is a place from which we are all coming. Like you talked about the split that happened, and then the bridge, which is Christ. It doesn't matter. I mean, like when I'm not saying that anybody's, whatever you can do, it can never bring this rift back. There's nothing that a human being can do to make that rift come back. Whatever you think of as is goodness or whatever I can say, okay, this person is worse than me, but it's not. We are not going to be judged on that. There is a level at which, okay, I guess it's a little bit more complicated, but I think that there's some people are not going to be saved. Simple as that. Some people are going to be saved, but not because of themselves, but because of grace.
I think everybody is saved because of grace.
But not the whole world is not going to be saved.
No. What I'm saying is, whether or not you're saved, it's all by grace.
Can we get back
but I'm actually talking about food.
Okay. Let's do this conversation somewhere else. Let's do this at another time, because I think Julia wants to say something. Go ahead, Julia.
Right. Here is Dante, who should have been writing proper theology in Latin. Instead, he does this marvelous radical thing of deciding to write this tremendous poem, which is theology through and through. When he's a lay person, he's exiled, he's excommunicated, he is outside. And what he does, there was a wonderful modern retelling of Dante's Commedia, a kind of science fiction story, where the character is in this modern world and he goes through all of the various terraces in hell. At one point, there are cars that are racing around and so on and so forth. And his guide is named Benito. And finally, at the very end of it, Benito has to sacrifice himself to save this protagonist, and does. And you suddenly realize it's Benito Mussolini. It's a wonderful kind of, because Virgil was also seen as a magician figure, as a necromancer. He is not the right guide for Dante. He's taking Dante into hell in the wrong direction. Dante's playing wonderful games where he's educating his reader to educate his reader's soul through his own mistakes. He dramatizes. He commits all of the 7 deadly sins going through hell. He participates in them all. And we do with him in order to learn what they are and to avoid them beyond the fiction of the poem. His son says his poem is all fiction, but it's fiction to save us. And he puts himself in the place of Adam, and who turns into Christ, who sacrifices himself for us, using his own state, which would have been considered to be of damnation, excommunicated, exiled, and so forth. But he transforms that, as we are meant to do, from the tragedy of the pagan world into the comedy of the Christian world of salvation. And he literally begins it, nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita, which is like the beginning of Genesis and the beginning of John. In the beginning was the Word. But he's bringing it up to date to 1300 Florence, which is also bringing it up to date to 2020 in America and in Europe and in Africa, everywhere. He is being the poet prophet for us, and by doing that, he's willing to place himself in shameful situations as the I don't know how to say it, as the focus, not the focus. I can't remember the right word, but
the protagonist.
As a protagonist, but also there's another word I wanted to use, and I can't put my finger on it. But the act of reading Dante well, as the contadini do, as soul text, not as mind text, should result in us having this vision of God who mirrors us, which is a bit like Rosie the cat and Maya mirroring each other. But in this case, when they are in heaven. And Dante's teacher, when his students were taking down these notes on the shape of the cosmos with the angelic orders, they included amongst the thrones and powers and so forth man. So there was no abyss, there's no rib valley between God and man. And if you read as Dante hoped we would, you will come to that mirroring.
And I think this brings us
Saving one.
full circle to the idea of. I'm sorry, Julie. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt, but can you hear?
Yes.
Okay, great. I was just saying that this brings us full circle to the idea of poetry, like the role of poetry as something that speaks to a human experience that is universal. Elizabeth, you had said earlier that grief is grief, that joy is joy, right? You lose a mother, you lose a child, you lose a brother, anywhere you are in the world, at any time you've ever lived as a human being, that sense of loss is the same. You celebrate joys in the same way. The world over, when your funny bone is tickled, we laugh. The vocabulary of the laughter might be different. Some people might guffaw, some people might giggle, maybe cover their mouths. Some people might just roll uncontrollably, right? But the impulse to express that experience is universal, and so you recognize grief or pain in another, regardless of what the external expression per se is. And therein lies I think the bridge for empathy,
Yes.
right? And this
Yes.
bridge for empathy, I think this is where the work of poetry resides, because I've always formulated that the way poetry works is that it's not so much about expression, right? Like, not so much the expression of joy or the expression of love, but rather the representation of that experience in such a way that when you read it on the text, not only do you recognize what's being represented, like I said, represented rather than described, rather than expressed, but being represented, not only do you recognize it, but as you recognize it, you also give it life by reliving it yourself, right? You read a story about uh, Elizabeth, may I ask, have you read anything like from the beginning, from book one maybe, or like, I'm trying to find a concrete something to anchor the example on.
Unfortunately, I haven't. I've
Not
just
yet. Okay, let me think of a common story that we might all share. Oh, okay, this maybe would be a good way to actually honor Chadwick Boseman. I've been thinking about him all day, and I was deeply, I felt quite pained when I heard the news that he had passed away. He's the
oh yeah, that
he's the
was
actor. Yeah, he's the actor who played Black Panther in the
yeah.
film. I don't know if you've seen the film Julia, the Black Panther. Julia, have you seen the film Black Panther?
I've not seen the
You've not
film.
seen it?
I've
Well,
only heard of him today,
uh,
but read about him,
mhm.
and
Yeah, you should watch that
it's
movie.
a loss.
I highly recommend the film. It's really, really wonderful. But let me just, for a common example, just let me use a scene which I think is going to be familiar, even if you haven't seen the film. Um, there's a moment when the prince, the main protagonist, the prince, who is also the Black Panther, is coming back home with his general, who's his main bodyguard, and an ambassador to his court, who's also a woman that he's in love with, right? Um, and and it's a fairly uneventful scene because they're in a spaceship, or like they're in a fairly moving fast flying ship, and as they're approaching home, you like they're all happy to see their homeland again. They're about to land home, but the actor who plays the prince, yes, he sees that he's home, but his eyes never leave this woman, this ambassador. He's constantly looking at her, right? Now, it's a small thing because they don't draw a lot of attention to it. I happen to have watched the movie about like 9 or 10 times in the movie theaters, so I kept noticing it. But that small thing of the this man who can't, he's going to be crowned in a little while because his father just passed away. This is a very fraught moment. They're arriving back in their kingdom after a really tumultuous absence, and they're bringing this ambassador back with them. And the very subtle gaze that he won't avert from her because he keeps looking at her, that in and of itself, without any words spoken, you're left with that experience of remembering what it feels like to so love someone that you can't get enough of looking at them.
And
You
this
know?
is Beatrice and Dante in Paradiso.
Exactly. There you
And
go.
she is
Exactly.
smiling at him. You know,
Exactly.
the scholars all say that Dante was so dour and so severe, like the
Mm, mm,
statue
mm,
in
mm.
Santa Croce. He's not. There's
Yeah.
so much laughter
Right.
in the
There you
commedia.
go. And in that,
And this
I,
smile of Beatrice,
mhm.
this is what a mother must do with her babies.
Yes.
That is where the baby learns empathy.
Yes.
The mirroring of the
Yes.
smile between the mother and the child
S-
is the first experience of love that the child has.
Look at how we just took this simple scene from a movie of a man who cannot get enough of looking at the woman he loves and transported it into the idea of a mother looking at her child and through her smile teaching that child empathy and love, you know? So there's something universal about the idea of just eyes meeting eyes, or at least the gaze taking in the beloved and reciprocating, which is the realm of poetry. And it doesn't need to be described. You just observe it, you see it, and you recognize it, and you know it, and you can transpose it into different ways. Which brings me full circle now, if I may, segue back into rain, right? Into the moment where it's a very brief canto where um, uh, um, before you get the details of what happened to Maya, right? Before you get the details of, like, she's already been injured, but her brother isn't back yet. And suddenly the canto cuts, and you're having a memory of Esther walking in on her mother holding the new baby. And the mother is making sounds that Esther, who is maybe, I don't know, 5 years old, has never heard her mother make.
Yeah.
They're cooing sounds. They sound like clear crystalline water. They sound like pure joy. Their sounds, like to her, sound like sunshine. And she's really mystified because of where they're coming from. They're coming from this mother whose voice to all the children is gravel and glass, right? Whose voice is always violent and cutting and forbidding, right? But with this little baby, the woman is all tenderness and love. And what's really interesting to me, I was reading this last night and I was like, why is it that this came out like this? And going back to your question, Elizabeth, of the things that surprised me about this story, I was like, why did it come out like this? And why is this canto inserting itself in the middle of so much violence, right? And it occurred to me that the thing that you just said now, Julia, is, I think, is very pertinent. The idea that Esther herself, by proxy, even though she has this innate empathy, innate sense of compassion about her as a child, she's already 5 years old, and we see her at age 2 already very compassionate toward her troubled brother. But here at age 5, she gets the first glimpse of like an external model for tenderness, and she bonds with the infant who is inspiring those that voice, right? Like, it is the first time Esther has a concrete experience of falling in love intentionally, because she's able to witness someone else falling in love, right? She might be empathic and compassionate, but it's not until she sees an example of love that she learns that it's possible, you know? And I think this contrasted, you bring it up with David last week, contrasted with David's trauma. David, who never knows any of that tenderness, who never knows any of that compassion, any of that music, any of that joy, and who is broken and damaged in all kinds of ways, right? Because of the absence of that simple gaze, that simple smile, that simple maternal, caress. Anyway, that thought came to my mind as you were talking. Ah.
So I haven't. I have a son who's really who has had this kind of background in his education. So really enjoy this kind of conversation. So I have read some, but not a whole lot. I'm a scientist, so my path, my background is a little bit different. But
how old is your son?
Oh, he's Miles. He's 22. He's at Columbia, so he hasn't finished school yet. But he has a really strong liberal art background. He went to, I don't know if you've heard of, you went to Harvard, right? Yeah, he went to Deep Springs. I don't know if you know a school called Deep Springs. Anyway, so, and then he's at Columbia now, but they really, it's a school of like 15 kids. They completely immerse them in that. So I've learned a lot from him. But
and what does he study? What's his major?
Math.
Math. Okay.
After spending all his younger life doing liberal arts, so yeah, this is very interesting, and really, when I was in high school, I really could have gone towards liberal arts, but I went towards science. But I remember really being really interested in history and all, and that's why I still listen to people like Zizek, just to
here's something that might really tickle your fancy. During Dante's time in the 1300s, education was very sort of panoramic.
Yeah.
The kind of like discipline segregation that we have now, where you either study the sciences or the liberal arts, that's a fairly recent sort of formal split. Whereas during his time, you got I think a comprehensive education, starting with the sort of the basics of language and the use of language and the craft of language, right? In the form that, like, the three disciplines that covered that are like grammar, rhetoric, and logic, right? Grammar being just basic, like formation of words and syntax, etc. Yeah, rhetoric being the ability to use language beautifully and persuasively, right? And then logic being able to use language for argumentation, right? To make a case for something. And once you get past this level, then the next level includes the quadrivium, which is the disciplines that are categorized as the mathematical arts. And they start with arithmetic, right, which is discrete quantities, right, and their relationship to one another, followed by geometry, which is not just discrete quantity, but proportions, right? Geometry is about the relationship or proportions between quantities. And then after that comes music, which is the discrete quantities, but in motion, right? Like for the passage from one to the next, passage from one to the next. And then astronomy, which is the study of these proportions and volumes in motion, right? So there's this kind of logic, this sort of like dynamic logic from arithmetic to astronomy in as per mathematical arts. And so this constituted basic education, like a fundamental education.
I think I had that actually. I kind of had that, but at a higher level. You know, like I did not
Right,
did not
exactly.
that is poem, you
Exactly.
understand it at that level.
Right.
But I think that all the way from high school to undergraduate, it's still that kind of I think I have the basics, but I
Right.
have not had the chance to really study the poems and
Right, exactly.
yeah. So
And so the idea then is once you have this basic foundation, then people develop in other ways. Like they're theologians, philosophers, doctors, scientists, like scientists of like natural philosophy, which is like physics, biology, medicine, et cetera, et cetera. Music, et
Theology
cetera, et
being the
cetera.
queen of sciences.
Say that again?
Theology in medieval England is the queen
The
of
queen of
science. She's
sciences,
Beatrice.
right? But
And
science in the sense of like knowledge, right? Science not in
yes.
the sense of like, how do you say, microscopes and telescopes and things like that, right?
And I've been spending years, 50 years, working on Dante's Teacher and the texts he dictated to Guido and Dante and Francesco. And we're now publishing these, and they're wonderful because they are encyclopedias, but at the same time they're also teaching rhetoric by creating an evil character and how he uses rhetoric incorrectly to persuade people to evil, and also those who have integrity, who use rhetoric properly, like Cato. Those who use it incorrectly are like Ulysses and so forth. And it was a wonderful training. It was training for law and literature and theology eventually.
Unfortunately, I have to go to attend something at it's 4. So
Yes.
thank you.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you,
And
Elizabeth.
I know that we got quite excited when we're talking about faith and and grace and all that.
Well, that's not very familiar to me.
But I think that is those are such important conversations, and I think and like I would be so always very happy to have them. Maybe we can even like arrange a time to continue the conversation, because I think it's always open ended, right? It's always an evolution. It's always an exchange. It's always a back and forth. So I'm so glad that you came. I hope that you come to the rest of the other roundtables, because even without the experience of reading the book, you still had some really good questions to ask, especially about like writing.
No, I will read the book, but the only thing is I have different things going on. So I won't be able to come every single time, but occasionally I'm an
Yes, please. The door is always open. Okay. Thank you so much for coming.
Nice meeting you, Julia.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Okay, nice.
Bye. Hey, Julia.
Right.
That was exciting.
It's my pumpkin hour. Yes. It's 10 o'clock.
Oh, it's 10 o'clock. Shall I let you go then, my dear? Or would you like to talk some more?
I'm so I look forward to these so much.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
Very, very much.
Me too. Today the things that you said really had me thinking. May I ask you one more thing before I let you go, since we're still talking about before. What did you think? Because you talked about the tenderness of Alex, and what was your reception of Maya's forgetting when Alex begins to go? This is where forgetting begins.
Right. That is the way you deal with trauma. And this is one of the reasons why, when there has been trauma, Anna Freud said during the bombing that you needed to have the children speak, tell, write, draw, whatever. And I said to a friend of mine whose granddaughter saw the Notre Dame fire in Paris, get her to do a drawing about it, because it's incorrect for it to be silenced and forgotten, because then it will really fester. And today, reading your book 4, realizing it begins in Nairobi, when the bomb happened in Nairobi,
Mm-hmm.
I had a friend who was living there, and she immediately, it was the beginning of the web,
Mm-hmm.
and she said, we need to do something. And I had no money. I was living in one unheated room.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, I don't know what to do. And I said, what I will do is send you blessed olive leaves.
Mm-hmm.
And it was amazing because we went to DHL
Mm-hmm.
and they sent it through as documents. And then I got the email saying, no, we can't possibly send blessed olive leaves because they have to have a phytosanitary certificate and so on.
Mm-hmm.
They had already arrived in Nairobi and
Uh-huh.
they were given out on the mountain
Mm-hmm.
when they were, following this terrible event.
Mm-hmm.
And they were giving them out in baskets
Mm-hmm.
and they seemed not to run out. I mean, it was just an envelope this size.
Mm-hmm.
But I got stories about people having leaves in their Bibles.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one woman who came to the cathedral. She was so badly hurt that she couldn't get out of bed. And somebody gave her the olive leaf. And she got out of bed. She got on the bus. She came to the cathedral,
Mm-hmm.
crying and laughing
Mm-hmm.
with the olive leaf, saying
Yeah, yeah.
this. And what it meant was just somebody far away caring. It
Mm-hmm.
was more than money.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I think when I found it very difficult when I first came to America at 16 after having lived through the bombing, and the Americans didn't want to hear about it.
Mm-hmm.
I never had a chance to really work through the trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And I found myself today with a film on the Facebook about an Irish woman in the post office who was reporting the weather to
Mm-hmm.
allow for the D-Day invasion. Well, I was there in Sussex when that was taking place, and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
there I was with the tears coming down. It was so moving.
Yeah, yeah.
I've never been able to grieve about that at the
Mm-hmm.
time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is why you have Maya forgetting.
Mm-hmm.
And I fell off a ladder the other day, and
Are
with
you
the
okay?
then I just didn't notice how bad
Oh,
all the bruises were.
oh,
They kept getting worse every day.
oh
But
dear.
at the time these things happen, you
Mm-hmm.
block. And
Mm-hmm.
it's part of the body,
Mm-hmm.
mind healing itself.
Mm-hmm.
But it also can, if it's not allowed any expression,
Mm-hmm.
then it will damage. And
Right, right, right.
needs, and this is partly why we need
Mm-hmm.
films, poems.
Right, right,
Straight history doesn't do it.
right, right. Exactly, exactly. I agree. I agree. And the sad thing about history itself is that even that too
Yeah,
can be tailored in a way to serve the needs of a
Camoens instead of your chapter.
exactly, and so so the histories end up being even more damaging, right,
Mhm.
than not. Are you okay though?
Oh yes,
Are you
I mean
recovered? Okay.
there's just four enormous
Okay,
bruises.
okay, okay,
They're
okay.
taking their time, and I'd
Mm-hmm.
already done broken a rib at
Mm-hmm.
Christmas on my bicycle,
Oh
so
my God.
you can't. There's nothing they can do, so you
Yeah.
just don't go. Because it takes about for a broken rib, it takes about 6 weeks
Oh goodness.
to get over. This is passing, but I've
Okay.
now agreed with my Roma that I will no
Mhm.
longer climb ladders. I will get
No,
them.
don't. Yeah,
And
don't.
it's wonderful that here I am living with
Mhm.
illiterate Roma who are very
Mhm.
intelligent, and I can tell them where to put the books.
Mhm.
And the fact
Mhm.
that we're all living together in a world
Mhm.
where I'm writing books, there are
Mhm.
books.
Mhm.
This is the best way to do a literacy
Mhm.
campaign.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um,
It really is. Yeah.
it's world of books is they're sleeping in part of the library. I'll never forget sleeping in Mont Saint Michel in the library. It was great when I was on pilgrimage there. The world of books is not the real world, but it's where the voices, the ancestors, are talking to us. It's not in the oral form any longer. Although what I'm doing on the web is putting them back into. I've got all of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales now recorded. All of Dante, I use the Temple Classics, as well as Carlo Poli in Italian, and I've got you could just click on the arrows to hear which one you want to as you read the text. Which parallel text doesn't do it as well. But if you're both hearing and seeing at the same time, it really penetrates your brain.
Yeah, it does.
Completely.
You
So I
know,
think, in the sense, we may be going back to an oral culture.
yes, I think that would be fantastic. I sometimes fantasize about, this is going to sound really silly, but sometimes I fantasize about if I were ever given the possibility to time travel, like if someone ever told me, you get to go to any place in time and you won't cause any damage, your presence there won't cause any damage, so there's no collateral. You just get to witness that firsthand, which I think would be ideal to do it as a dream walker, right? Where you're there in spirit and you're not really interacting with anything. You can witness
You'd be in the
everything.
Valestina castle listening to Dante reciting a canto.
I would actually would like to sit in his workshop while he's, not when he's reciting it in performance, but while he is actually writing it, the moment he's setting it on paper.
Parchment.
To see, to hear, to witness the materialization of these, they're just thoughts first, immaterial, ephemeral, spectral even, but to witness the moment when they become materialized into words that are put on paper, to witness his development, evolution, and growth through the transfer of, in the Augustinian way, right? Transferring that which he is seeing before him into the memory that he's laying on paper, onto that page in the, the book of his memory, where we can then access it. I would love that.
Yeah, I need your address, and I will send you the DVD. DVD. Sorry, Italian pronunciation. And because I think I found the manuscripts that Dante himself wrote out at
Seriously?
Brunetta Station,
Really?
including his designs of the squaring of the circle and so forth.
Are you serious?
I've got it all in facsimile with transcription.
Oh my God! Yes, I will send you my.
Well,
Oh my God!
it's a hypothesis, but the whole group of manuscripts of the Tesoro in Italian, which are dated around the 1280s, which is precisely the time that Brunetto has come back to Florence, very active in the Florentine communal government, and he is teaching. And his students are always said to be Guido, Dante, and Francesco. And then what happens after Dante dies, Francesco sets up a publishing house and churns out, it's said in the legend, and I can find 60 of them, 100 copies of the Commedia for his daughter Staris. And beautiful manuscripts. He has scribes working under him. And he also edits again Brunetto's writings. So we've got the versions that Brunetto gave in the 1280s, and then we have the versions that Francesco went back to the original versions in the 1300s, 13.
Mhm.
And it's just been fascinating because it really is Dante's formation.
Mhm.
He's learning Aristotle's ethics
Mhm.
and Brunetto and Africanus's astronomy and so
Mhm.
forth.
Mhm.
What I loved was I was working on the computer with the
Mhm.
text on the screen of Brunetto's Aristotelian ethics.
Mhm.
10-year-old Roma girl who was living in the streets begging, but
Mhm.
she was going to school and this was her third language.
Mhm.
She read it off the computer screen perfectly. And it was a section on justice.
Mhm.
Then they threw mother, who was a widow,
Mhm.
and had two children out of Florence. They had to flee to
Mhm.
France, where they met with again the
Mhm.
terrible discrimination. Then they went to Spain.
Mhm.
I think they're doing all right now, but
Mhm.
I was so moved by this 10-year-old girl in
Mhm.
extreme poverty,
Mhm.
just with this marvelous competence, and it was so right for her to be reading about justice
Mhm.
at the same moment so unjust
Mhm.
the situation she was having to live in. I
Mhm.
went storming into the Palazzo Vecchio with the
Mhm.
photograph of this family that we took
Mhm.
in and said, look, you can't do this to these
Mhm.
people.
Mhm.
So, but the politics, the racism is very, very strong.
Mhm. Mhm.
At least I can get away with speaking against it, being
Mhm.
a nun and a foreigner,
Mhm.
sort of outside of the system. But I don't see how within the system you can undo it, except the ways we're trying.
You know, I
Mm,
thought about you when I saw that video that I tagged you on of the man who feeds the poor.
yeah.
You know, the video that I tagged you on of the man who feeds the poor in India.
Right, yes.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
thought about you then, and to the question of not knowing what we can do is I recognize that the systemic problems need to be addressed, right? Because
yes.
the institutional problems simply endorse and perpetuate the injustice.
Mm-hmm.
But that aside, the individuals who are day to day making a difference, whether it be through feeding the poor or seeing to their education, um, ensuring that they get to participate in the social body in a
Yes,
way that is meaningful to them.
yes.
Essentially, people who are not complicit in systems of exclusion
Right.
and
Mm-hmm.
discrimination, people who purposely make it a point to commune with um, uh, and 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 experience love with the unloved, with the most unloved.
Well, this is the
This
essence
is this
of,
this makes a difference. This is
yes.
important, you know. In fact,
Mm,
it's probably more important, and it is the root of any kind of systemic or institutional change that's going to take place, because institutions don't change until people insist that they change.
yes.
Um, and oftentimes, if people are happy with the status quo, even if they see injustices, if they if they don't have any other options to consider, then they will just maintain. It's like, you know, the devil, you know, they'll keep with the status quo even if they might intuit that there's a better way, you know.
Yes,
So
perhaps so, like Maya forgetting,
mhm,
perhaps I'm sort of trying to grapple with what is it in these people who are racist,
mhm.
because what I'm seeing is that they don't see what they're doing. Like, remember
Willfully
that,
so, because they're
yes,
not stupid. It's
giving
willful.
themselves the envious.
Mhm, mhm,
When they're expiating their envy, their eyes are sewed up.
mhm, mhm,
But
mhm,
if they're envious in hell, they really can't see. But the envious in the purgatory are able to help guide each other around the precipice.
Do you know what I think? I
So,
think that the closest parallel from a Dantean perspective to racist, and especially like white supremacist racists who also perpetrate terrorism and brutalization, including colonizers, including people who have no compunction about going to destroy people's lives in order to quote unquote save them. The parallel that I see is with Brancadoria and Fra Alberigo. Remember, Brancadoria and Fra Alberigo are the souls down in their souls down in Giudecca, who are betrayers of family. And
right.
Dante is surprised when he sees Fra Alberigo. He's like, wait a second, but I thought I saw you just the other day up in the street. And Fra Alberigo says, yeah, well, there's this thing that Giudecca manages to do, which is there's some souls that are just so rotten, especially when they betray
Yes.
kin like this,
Mhm.
that Giudecca pulls that soul
Mhm.
into its bosom, and a demon instead goes and possesses that body, and it's a walking around a carapace, walking around with no soul inside it. It's just like
Right.
it's just whatever. And the reason why I say that is because I cannot see how anyone of conscience can perpetrate these kinds of brutalizations and injustice.
Mhm.
And I cannot see how a living soul can move through the world without a conscience, right? And so this
I
is the closest allegory. This is the closest allegory
I
I have. You know,
I
people who are essentially categorized as psychopaths, right?
yeah. This
So,
I think is the problem.
mm,
That uh, a child with who is traumatized, as
mhm,
for instance David is in the
mhm,
book.
mhm,
I don't know what will happen with David eventually,
mhm, mhm,
but somebody like Boris Johnson, who's gone through Eton,
mhm,
uh, their souls are so damaged by that trauma
mhm,
that they cannot empathize.
mhm,
That and think I think the problems lie with parenting, the wrong
mhm,
parenting. That's
mhm,
only materialistic. It's not about the smile between the mother and the baby.
mhm,
Um, and then I think the education that's on top of that,
mhm,
the trauma of pedophilia and so forth, this
mhm,
will result in people whose souls are dead,
mhm,
who will be the racists, who will
mhm,
be, um, and in a sense, it's an enormous tragedy that that has happened. To,
mhm. It is. I agree.
um,
Because I think one of the most interesting things about Judecca's ability to do that, the ability to pull the soul that is betrayed,
mhm,
kin,
mhm,
even long before the death of the actual individual. I think the allegory reads to me as this is the poet talking about, or at least dramatizing, the utterly unconscionable
mhm,
um, nature of what it means to break that natural bond of kinship
yes,
in betrayal.
mhm,
All the other sort of species of betrayal that you have, right, from Caina to Ptolemy, they all have sort of an Aristotelian ethical logic to them that makes perfect sense, like schematically speaking. When I explain it to students, they usually go, "Oh, I see," because I explain Aristotle's ethics in terms of like how society is put together, and
yes,
show how Dante is essentially, if Aristotle goes family and then state and then neighbor states and then empire, right? Or universe, whichever you want, then Dante has in greater degrees of gravity. um, Betrayal of family is the outermost, and then betrayal of guest of neighbor, I guess, is the next one, and then betrayal of state and betrayal of a benefactor being the most grave of them all. They see the logic where it's not so much about the betrayal of the person who's closest to you, but the ethical impact and reverberation that
Yes.
betrayal has across society, right? The wider the sphere of influence, the more ethically grave it is. And so the thing that strikes me as interesting about like the betrayal of kin being like of that area of hell being able to pull the soul down is if that degree of betrayal, the betrayal of a kin, is that unconscionable, right? And it is that unconscionable precisely because family is the core from which society, in the Aristotelian sense, is constituted. The poet is saying something truly, truly profound about the noxious nature of betrayal and how betrayal destroys the essence of not just individual kinship, but of society as a whole, right? And when I think about, going back to what we were just talking about, when I think about what the predators that we see around us do when they hunt down unarmed Black citizens, men and women alike, or they barge into their houses and shoot them in their beds, or shoot them while they're playing video games with their nephews and nieces, or strangle them when they're out for a jog, or shoot them when they're out, grocery shopping with their families. When I see these predators do this, and I think about it in terms of Ptolemaea, like in terms of these soulless creatures who lack no conscience, it brings me back, curiously enough, it brings me back to the idea that every time they do this, they are perpetrating the worst kind of betrayal against their kin, their fellow brothers and sisters.
Right.
They don't see them that way because they see them as the other. They see them as insects and vermin to be annihilated. And yet, the logic of Dante's interpretation of Aristotle's ethics says that every such violation is a betrayal of kin.
Yes.
And it breaks my heart every time, but not with empathy for them because I don't have that big a heart. It breaks my heart because I think of all the other potential kin who could run afoul of their capricious need to just destroy because they can,
It's
This, yeah. Anyway, my dear Julia.
what's happening in America with guns.
Mm,
It is a lack of. I came to America at 16
mm,
and found it was a very cold place.
mm,
It was superficial niceness, but it's not deep. And then I came back with the baby in my arms, and I can remember being in the Chicago airport, large bag, the baby in my arms, and a suitcase, and I couldn't manage the escalator, and I had to make a connection. And the red cap porter, you probably don't remember them. These you paid them to help you with your suitcases. Back in those days, people had large suitcases. And I was saying to him, he was offering to help me, and I was saying I don't have any money because I haven't changed to dollars yet. And he said, "Ma'am, I'll help you." And here he was, Afro American, and I'd never had that kindness from a white American. And that's where I always found kindness in America.
And that's where you still find it.
Hispanic communities, not in the white communities.
No, this is where you'll find it. Look at the responses of the families of the slain young men and women. Time and again, when the microphone is held to their faces, the father of Jason Blake, the father of the family of George Floyd, the families of all these young men and women across. Every time they're asked, what do you have to say? The families of the 9 who were slain in the church by that boy who came in and had the service with them and then shot them afterwards because he was out to get niggers, right? But you turn to listen to their response. It is consistent all the time. They always invoke love. They
Yes.
always call for forgiveness. And the way I feel about it, I think to myself, like, but how can they? Like, how is this possible? That because I would want to just, I would be Samson bringing the temple walls down. I
Um,
I play Verdi's Requiem every time there's a
yes.
death like this, because that sound of hellfire and brimstone is the only catharsis I can find. And so I don't know how these families, and it's a very Afro-American thing. It's a very African American thing. This almost intuitive turn to forgiveness and love, despite the putrid and rancid nature of the kind of oppression and siege that they've been subjected to for so many centuries. It's inspiring and it's humbling,
Yes. Um, we here in this cemetery, Frederick Douglass visited here. Theodore Parker, who spoke about the arc of the moral compass bending slowly, but it bends towards justice.
Mm,
Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Francis Trollope writing against slavery were so deeply involved. Here in this spot in Florence, which Dante knew,
mhm,
um, with America, with
mhm,
this history.
mhm,
Sarah Parker Raymond got her medical degree, Black American, in
mhm,
1868, when no woman could be an MD. She did
mhm, mhm,
at Santa Maria Nuova Hospital.
mhm,
And she was a reader at the Gabinetto Vicio. Robert lied to Elizabeth and said women weren't allowed
mhm,
entry to the Gabinetto Vicio,
mhm,
but women were. Marion Wordsworth, who was William Wordsworth's daughter-in-law,
mhm,
she was a reader. She's buried here and so forth. And the history of this place is about, and what I've loved is that it's gone full circle. I'm in a lot of difficulty right now with
mhm,
the Roma. Um, they want to terminate my employment here. It's not
mhm,
paid,
mhm, mhm,
um, but it's been full circle that the
mhm,
Roma who had been slaves
mhm,
were able to come here as a sanctuary and
mhm,
restore this place
mhm,
as a showcase of their
mhm,
skills as
mhm.
gardeners, as restorers, as stonemasons.
Can you
Uh,
specify what place that is, just so that people who are listening can know what place you're talking about?
mm, that I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
Can you specify what place you're talking about, so that people who are listening can know where you're talking about?
Well, I'm talking about the English cemetery, so called.
Mhm,
It's owned by
mhm,
the Swiss in
mhm,
Florence.
mhm,
It's by the Porta Fiesole, which no longer exists.
mhm,
But that's the gate out of which Dante and Beatrice would have gone in the
mhm,
summers to where
mhm,
it would be cooler, away from
mhm,
malaria and
mhm,
mosquitoes.
mhm,
And it's probably in the Etruscan tomb.
mhm,
And then Michelangelo, well, first Arnolfo di Cambio built the wall and the gate.
mhm,
Then
mhm,
Michelangelo built another one against the Medici.
mhm,
He hated the Medici.
mhm,
And then the 19th century, we have the foreigners who couldn't be buried in Catholic cemeteries
mhm,
were buried here. It was kind of potter's field, and we
mhm,
find beautiful fragments of medieval and Renaissance pottery in it.
mhm,
Um, but it's so, this was a place for suicides and Masons and
mhm,
Protestants and Anglicans and
mhm,
Orthodox,
mhm,
everyone that the Catholics would not accept in
mhm,
consecrated ground.
mhm,
And and they're a wonderful group of people who were fighting against slavery. And their works, Richard Hildreth and Francis Trollope write the first two anti-slavery novels. That's copied by Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was translated next year into Romanian and freed the Roma from their slavery. But then they were in the Holocaust, left to starve in open fields, and they all know the names of the family members who died. Starvation was so great that they sometimes ate their babies, and they had this on their conscience. So we did the ceremony here in the cemetery with the Romanian Orthodox priest, giving the names of all of the family members, the candle and the bread and the wine and the banquet, because they believe that if you have the banquet with the dead, they are eating with you and undoing their starvation. And the Roma have these very strict ideas about the importance of burying the dead honorably. And they will give up their homes to pay for funerals. But in Transnistria, there was no coffin, there was no grave, there was no priest, there was no bread, there was no wine, there was nothing. And so after we did the ritual, their behavior changed. They became calmer with themselves. This was, the third generation since that. They can remember their aunts and grandmothers talking about it. And it took many years for them to even tell me what had happened. And when they did, I realized that we had to do something to undo the trauma. And I think trauma isn't undone with money.
No.
It's undone with kindness and a gesture that says, yes, I know this happened and this was wrong, and I am with you, and I will help shoulder this with you. That's how we have sort of, and also because we saved the babies from being taken from them, that I have never seen people work so well and so hard. And it's because I don't tell them what to do. They already figured out and they've done it. It's done with freedom. It's not coerced work. And I think those are the strategies we need. But I don't know how to share this experience. But I think it's important to have it be known about.
Yes, I think so too.
Traumas elsewhere.
This is why I love hearing you talk about it, and this is why I ask you questions about it, so that you can elaborate and so that others might hear. Because it goes back to something that we talk about all the time, the importance of storytelling.
Yes.
Because the storytelling matters not just in the sort of that structured, let's now sit down and enjoy the story, or let's write this book and make it available. Storytelling is the sharing of experiences through exchange, communication, through song, through art, through just how are you today? How have you been? What are you doing? How are your family members, your friends, the people that you live with and work with? How's your hip today? How are your bruises? All of this is storytelling.
Yeah.
And they're all experiences that inform, I think they can contribute to our connection to one another as human beings.
Yes.
I think this is the stuff of love, right? This is where this is the fertile ground from which, you know, like the love is the ground, as it were. So it's not that the seeds of the ground. The love is the ground, and
Yeah.
when it is tilled and agitated and watered and fed and aerated, whatever seeds might fall on it have the opportunity to germinate and thrive. And and I think some of the seeds are these stories, you know, so that passers-by might then learn, oh, here's a place where this experience exists. I think it's very important that people know, not only about your experience and the work that you do, but also where. You know, I don't know if it'll be of any effect, but it would be so wonderful if someone hearing you talk about this developed an interest and decided to roll up their sleeves and offer a hand, you know, in whatever way that they could, rather than feel helpless, rather than feel like they can't do anything. Or, as you exemplify, rather than feel like, well, I don't have money, so I can't do anything. It's that's not it. I feel like, and this is not a self exculpatory at all, but I feel like our ability to have this conversation, at least for me, it's incredibly enriching because it grows my world in a way that it would not other I would not otherwise have. You know, because after the first time we met in Pennsylvania, after that we didn't really. I mean,
No.
I think it was contact in passing, right?
Yes.
Sort of accidental, but
Mhm.
the intentionality of these conversations
Yes. Mhm.
that becomes something that I really look forward to. You know, I know I tell people, yes, I'm doing the Rain Roundtable, but in my mind, I'm thinking, oh, I get to talk to Julie again this weekend. You know?
No, we do need more
Um,
people.
yeah, it's
um,
and it's
yeah.
okay. And it's okay to be just us. It's okay when other people come in. It's okay, whatever degree or whatever questions they have. That's all fine too. Um, but this is, I think this is good. I think this is good.
Yeah.
Mm.
I would love to see if we couldn't bring in Dennis Looney at some point.
Would he have time to read the book?
Uh, I
That's the
think
thing.
I think we need to do another roundtable on Dante,
Oh
and
yes, absolutely.
I think people like Dennis Looney, Justin Steinberg,
Hmm.
who's doing very interesting work on Dante.
Hmm.
He's in Rome now.
Hmm.
Um, Massimo Sariacopi is wonderful, but he doesn't have English.
Hmm.
So and he's the one who's translating my dreadful Italian into acceptable Italian.
Hmm.
Um, I was told by the president of the Società Dantesca Italiana, Julia, your Italian is not Italian. So I had to get help.
Hmm.
But I think it would be if let's think about
Okay, I will.
together.
Now that I'm getting the technology down, I have a pretty good
Yes.
sense of how to do this. I really like this platform much better than Zoom.
Uh,
It feels like it's gone much more smoothly. It's easier to set everything up, and
yeah. Good.
I'll look into it and maybe try and organize something, and
Uh,
have it be something that's open ended, and you know we have a start time and an end time, and just speak.
and
You
I
know.
think you should send a copy of this to Dennis Looney.
Okay, I will.
He's got his book published by the Notre Dame University
Hmm.
Press.
Hmm.
He's done very good work
Hmm.
in this area.
Okay.
Because I think the more we dialogue
Hmm.
uh, across these, the more we learn about each other,
Hmm.
valuing the
Yeah.
men.
Yeah.
And to
This
go
is good.
back to my Roma families, the thing that amazes me is their family ties are so much stronger than ours.
Mm.
And the, because we do the Underground Railroad with their babies, we
Mm.
built 17 cradles, rocking cradles with them. Um, I've had babies in this house, newborn and so
Hmm.
forth. they never allow the babies to cry.
Mm.
They're always rocked, held. They never
Mm.
put them in a separate room to
Mm.
cry their lungs out, which damages the brain. It will end
Mm.
up this.
Mm.
Um, and I took to giving them children's books of Dante's Commedia
Mm.
illustrated. And they said to me, no, we don't think the children should see the pictures of
Mm.
violence of the Inferno.
Mm.
And yet, children in America, there's
Mm.
a constant diet of
Mm.
cartoons of violence,
Mm.
which is training them to be like Spartans, like a warrior class,
Mm. Mm.
without empathy.
Psychopaths. We're just turning them into psychopaths, like mini psychopaths.
Yeah.
Teaching them it's perfectly okay to that killing is the option for resolving your problems. You know.
Mm-hmm.
Then I'm left flabbergasted how people absolutely refuse to understand that if you normalize in someone's head the idea that the way to resolve a problem is by killing, that's the way they're going to go about trying to resolve their problems. Like if you put it in their minds through the stories that you tell, that the way to resolve your problem is get rid of the bad guy, and the way you get rid of the bad guy
Mm-hmm.
is
Mm-hmm.
by killing.
Right, right. Mm-hmm.
It is no wonder that that's their go-to. It's no
That's why
wonder that
I
this
love
is such a
stories like
crazy,
Kenneth Graham's Reluctant Dragon
Mm?
or Ferdinand the Bull.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Do you know those stories?
No, I don't. I don't.
Ah, they're wonderful.
Mm-hmm,
Ferdinand the Bull is a story about bullfight.
mm-hmm,
Ferdinand is this great big bull, and they bring him into the arena.
mm-hmm.
He doesn't want to fight.
Mm-hmm,
And it's a wonderful story. And the
mm-hmm,
illustrations have the cork trees with
mm-hmm.
corks hanging on them, which I didn't catch on as a child until that when I was grown up. But Mungo Leaf wrote it.
Mm-hmm,
Ken Graham's story is lovely too, where the dragon doesn't want
mm-hmm,
to fight with St. George and so on and so forth.
mm-hmm.
And I think we need to change the stories.
Yeah.
And I've also, you know, I used to work before I was in graduate school, teaching
Mm-hmm,
nursery school.
mm-hmm,
And my aunt she was training teachers at that level.
mm-hmm,
And one of the books she was very fond of was Bruno Bettelheim's Uses of Enchantment.
mm-hmm.
You know it?
No, no, no. But I love the title, "Uses of Enchantment."
Yes.
Beautiful.
In the 40s and 50s, the psychologists were telling American families, don't have stories, fairy stories. They're
Mm-hmm.
not. It's not good for the children.
Oh, shit, shit, shit,
And
shit, shit.
Bruno Bettelheim, who had been at Auschwitz and
Mm-hmm,
came to America as a psychiatrist, he
mm-hmm,
said, yes, it's important for them to have stories.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, he suicided,
Oh.
but he was correct in talking about the values of stories where we
Mm-hmm,
create alternate universes. A
mm-hmm,
sandbox,
mm-hmm,
yeah,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes.
working things through in that way, which is what Dante is doing.
I love that idea. Sandbox of reality.
Which is what you're
Yeah,
doing in Rain and
yeah.
your series. Mhm. And this is why I love Pietro Allighieri's commentary to his
Mm-hmm,
father.
mm-hmm,
He's very clear that this
mm-hmm,
is fiction.
mm-hmm,
And he will describe how Dante finger Ulysses and so forth, that he
mm-hmm,
creates imaginary, fictional,
mm-hmm,
well, they're real people, but he puts them into fictional
mm-hmm,
positions,
mm-hmm,
like the speech that Ulysses gives, which
mm-hmm,
is actually taken from Catiline's speech,
mm-hmm,
where it's a suicide speech,
mm-hmm,
born to live as beasts,
mm-hmm,
and so forth. It's a speech for violence, but it's very attractive, and everyone thinks it's a
mm-hmm.
beginning of Renaissance,
Mhm.
and, and so forth. And I really have gone long past my pumpkin hour.
Let me let you go then, my dear. Let me let you go, and
And thank
let
you
me
so
just
much.
let me thank you. This is so wonderful. I really love how free flowing these conversations are, and today had its moments of excitement, and
We
I
talked
look
about
forward
the
to.
important part of the book today.
Yeah, we did, and I really appreciate your insights. I'm going to be listening to that again, especially what you had to say about the looking glass imagery and the shattered glass and the Maya doubled as the cat and vice versa. Because as I say always, these talks are always revelatory to me. I get to learn something new.
Well,
And
isn't it a bit like Dante's Vita Nuova, where he he begins for the fiction, he begins writing it, he doesn't understand it. And then with the death of Beatrice, a whole new level is
yeah,
open for him to see.
and I think this is part of the reason why Augustine's
Yes.
description of time as music that's being sung really resonates with me to this day. I mean, it was very intentionally that I used that as an epigraph, because besides describing that experience of encountering the story and committing it to the memory of the written word,
Mhm.
um, there's also the fact that the entire story of Rain is a sung experience, right?
Yes.
Everybody's singing in this story,
Yes.
even when there's no quote unquote singing voice. I think Mary, when she did her review, she noticed right away that
Mhm.
the language sings, right?
Yes.
Um, and to end on a note that just recalls Karen's question about like author intentionality, the moments that I was describing earlier where I was sort of struggling with the text were those moments where I would hear the singing
Mhm.
sound and I'd go, this is so weird. Why is this rhyming? Like, why is all of this stuff rhyming? I don't understand why this is all rhyming. And this is especially
Well,
true.
as you know, Dante speaks even in Paradiso when
This,
he shouldn't be.
yes, this is the
He's talking
thing.
about the muses inspiring him.
Yes, and the thing
And
about
what
it is,
he's doing is,
mhm,
and you are doing,
mhm,
are getting in touch with the right hemisphere.
mhm, mhm.
You're not being the academic left hemisphere.
Right, 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 right.
And the right hemisphere sees so much more
Mhm,
than
mhm.
the left can.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
is why I feel it's so tragic that Boccaccio was giving his lectures on the canto at time.
Mhm.
Because Dante's cantos are not boxes,
Exactly,
all in sort
exactly,
of interlace with everything else in the poem.
exactly, exactly.
Pianino with Romeo and so
Mhm,
forth.
mhm, mhm.
This is why
Exactly.
we three cantos at a time.
Right, right. And I
Because
remember, I like as a writer, I kept thinking like, why is this happening? And do you remember that there's an anecdotal story that's told about Dante that he thought in terza rime.
that he
He thought in terza rime.
right.
That
No, I
that
don't
or in terzine, sorry, or in terzine, like
yes,
his thought came out
yes,
in terzine. And when you
yes,
read the commedia, you realize that the thoughts do come out in terzine, like they're sort of like contained in this way.
yes.
And so I wondered to myself, like given the the
Right.
saturating depth of his influence on me, I remember
Mhm.
at some point wondering to myself, like, has Dante affected the way I think so that now I think in rhyme?
Right.
And it wasn't, I will tell you for sure, it wasn't intentional. I wasn't sitting there like working out what rhymes goes with what. The lines would just come out and then I'd read them back and I'd go, why is this rhyming? Like, why does it sound like this? And this was especially true in book 7, right? Which is a very violent book. And then there'll be
Yes.
moments where it's like this litany of just song over and over and over again.
Right.
And at a certain point, I had to just step back and let it be, and then maybe discover later what that was. But when we get to book 7, we can talk about it. So let me let you go, my dear. It is late. You are well past your bedtime.
And thank you.
Thank you
Right.
very much.
So I will
My
say
dear Julia,
God bless
absolutely.
you.
Please look
Yeah.
after yourself and don't climb any ladders, okay?
No, I'm not. I'm
Oh,
now getting. I feel dreadful about making people do my work, but at this point I realize at 83 I shouldn't be on ladders.
there you go. Okay. Okay, my dear. Mwah. Take
Yeah.
care. All right.
You too. Bless you.
You too,
Right.
my dear. Bye bye.
I don't know how to.
I think I can end it. There you go. There you go.